Okay, welcome to the 8th plenary session for the Science of Consciousness Conference. This session is entitled The Role of Consciousness in Decision-Making. My name is Sanguinetti. I am the Assistant Director at the Center for Consciousness Studies at the University of Arizona. And I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for the lineup today. Just a note that this video is being recorded. The structure of the plenary will be 4 talks with a duration of 25 minutes each. At the end of each talk, the speakers will ask each other questions for about 5 minutes. And then we will take questions from the audience after the 4th talk. If you have questions, please submit them in the chat button that says Q&A. Our first speaker is Aaron Schurger, who is an assistant professor at Chapman University. He is a member of the Institute for Interdisciplinary Brain and Behavior Sciences and is on the faculty at the Korean College of Health and Behavioral Sciences of the Department of Psychology at Chapman University. We're welcoming Aaron to the stage, but before Aaron comes on, our next speaker will actually give a brief introduction for his talk. This is Dr. Uri Maoz. Uri?
Thank you. Yes, let me share my screen. So I just wanted to say briefly that the panel today relates to a large ongoing project about how the brain enables causal conscious control of decisions and actions. This is a large international collaboration that you can see the different people here. It's funded by these different funding agencies. We call it the Neurophilosophy of Free Will, and you can find more information about it here in this, this address. Now, it's neuroscientists and philosophers from around the world that are collaborating together on these questions of free will. And we have on this website, we've got talks, seminars. We also have an international funding competition for students and postdocs, so you can go there for more information. One more thing that we're doing together is actually working on a book. Actually, all the PIs together are working on a book that Walter Sinnott-Armstrong and I are editing called Free Will, Philosophers and Neuroscientists in Conversation, and it's gonna come out next year by Oxford University Press. I think the book is interesting because we've asked leading philosophers and neuroscientists what questions they would most want to ask the other discipline about free will. And then we voted on the questions, and the 15 questions voted as most important, most interesting from each field to ask the other field we asked the experts to answer those questions. So we came up with 30 chapters overall. Then there were follow-up questions that were asked from both fields and answered. And we ended up with these chapters here that you can see. So the questions from neuroscientists to philosophers and questions from philosophers to neuroscientists. Being a neuroscientist, I might want to add that, you know, the neuroscientists ask philosophers simple questions like, what is an intention? What is will? What is free will? Short, simple questions. While the philosophers tended to ask these long questions like, how does the absence of consensus about the neural basis of consciousness and volition affect the arising about? But anyway, more seriously, I think we have very interesting questions and answers here, and I guess I'll stop this plug, a shameless plug here, and just say one more shameless plug is that we are seeking postdocs, PhD students, and RAs, and if you're interested, just let us know. And I think we should go to Aaron's talk.
All right, thank you, Uri. I'm gonna share my screen. So everyone, Uri? Yep. Do you see my screen, Uri? Okay, great, thanks. I'd like to thank the organizers for keeping this going in spite of COVID. Done an excellent job. I think I'll just jump right into my talk. I'm going to talk today about the readiness potential and how we've tried at least to use it to make inferences about conscious volition. The context that we work in when we talk about the readiness potential is context like the one depicted here, where you're going to perform an action, but there's no external, at least immediate, there's no immediate external cue telling you when to act. It is quote unquote up to you. If you lay this out on a timeline, say, well, at some point in time, you act, you jump, that's the observable, and we'd like to think that there's another variable there that's maybe at least not externally observable. We decide before we act, and that somehow that decision fixes the fact that we will be acting. Wouldn't it be nice if it were that simple? It turns out it's probably not. And I'm going to use this as a background for discussing how we use and have used the readiness potential to try and lay out different events on this timeline from deciding to acting. So the question really succinctly is, what determines when, precisely when, an action is initiated? This is an important question in a lot of different domains, not the least of which, as an example, is the development of brain-computer interfaces, where it's important, of course, for the interface to discern what the user wants to do, but it's equally important, if not more important, for the interface to be able to detect when the user wants to act and not respond otherwise. So the first and probably most well-known attempt to identify what is it in the brain that corresponds to this deciding act, this process of getting ready to move, was the discovery of the readiness potential in 1965 by Kornhuber and Deka. So they asked subjects to perform simple finger movements when they wanted to, at times of their own choosing. What they found was when they aligned the data here at time 0 to the time of movement, they found a buildup, a slow buildup of neural activity over motor areas of the cortex preceding the onset of the movement by up to 1 second or even a bit more. And notice here, by the way, that this is a negative, as measured using EEG, it's a negative going voltage potential, and here in this case, they've showed negative as going up rather than down. Just be aware of that. This was interpreted as the electrophysiological sign of planning, preparation, and initiation of volitional acts, and it's, although there's been a lot of controversy about the readiness potential, that general interpretation has held steady for all these years. It's not just an EEG thing, right? We also see this in single unit activity. Here on the right, you see a buildup in firing rate in single units in the pre-SMA. And it's not just a human thing. We see it in other species, including primates, rodents, and even invertebrates like the crayfish exhibit this sort of slow buildup, again, with roughly the same temporal profile of 1 or more seconds. Depending on how we measure this pre-movement buildup, as I call it, we give it different names. So with electroencephalography or EEG, we call it the readiness potential. When we measure it using magnetoencephalography, we call it the readiness field. With single unit recordings, we call it the readiness discharge. Different names, but it's the same underlying phenomenon, neurons doing the same thing, essentially. But what? Neurons doing what? Well, what we've presumed is that it's neurons getting ready to move, which is a reasonable presumption given the way the data look, even if perhaps not the correct one. But that was the presumption that was taken by Benjamin Libet, who some 20 years after the discovery, roughly 20 years after the discovery of the readiness potential, he performed an experiment where he recorded RPs from subjects while they were monitoring a clock like the one shown. It was a rapidly rotating clock, and they were simply asked, after they made a spontaneous movement, they were asked to report what time was it on the clock when they were first aware of their conscious decision to initiate the action, quote unquote, spontaneously. That's, of course, been a very controversial experiment. I won't go into the controversy around it, but Libet's view essentially is this one, that at some early time, roughly a half a second or 1 second or even more before the onset of the movement, the brain is getting ready to move, and then relatively late in the game, which Libet estimated to be about 200 milliseconds before the onset of the movement, is when subjects reported, on average, having been conscious of deciding to initiate the action. So it looks as if, from Libet's view, the brain is getting ready to move well in advance of the time that we at least report ourselves having consciously decided to move. It's difficult to argue in favor of conscious free will in the face of this kind of interpretation of the data. But again, I'm going to discuss why that interpretation might be incorrect, because it depends crucially on how we interpret the readiness potential. And importantly, we need to understand what the RP is before we can use it to make any inferences about conscious volition. And we don't yet, at least. That's at least one of the important points that I hope you'll take away from the talk, is that we don't yet even know what the readiness potential reflects. Why is this thing, this pre-movement buildup, difficult to interpret? Well, consider it in relation to an event following potential. So we in EEG research, we call these event-related potentials because we time lock the data to a certain event and then average. If we look in the upper panel at a visual evoked potential, so that's the brain's response to a visual event, the onset time of the event, which is the visual stimulus, that's determined by the experimenter, and it's usually randomized a bit so that it's independent, more or less, of what's been going on in the brain just in advance. The case of the readiness potential, however, depicted down below, right? That's not the case. So the same system, namely the brain, that is generating the signal is also determining the onset time of the event, the movement. So whatever you see in the average, because we're time locking to this event that is determined by the very same system that's generating the signal, we run the risk, at least, of discounting the prior probability of whatever it is we see in the average. Well, so what is the RP? What, at least as we know it today, what is it? It's a slow buildup of neural activity prior to spontaneous voluntary movement that we recover when data are time locked to movement onset and averaged over multiple epochs. That's what we know, and that's what the RP is, sort of by definition. What it reflects in neural terms is another matter. There are a number of puzzling questions that have remained kind of hanging in the air since the RP was discovered, really. Not all subjects even exhibit an RP, even though they can do the task, and we still don't know why. And the shape and onset time of the RP are highly variable across subjects. If you look at RPs of individual subjects, they are much more variable than event following potentials, like for example, a visual evoked potential in their shape and onset. And importantly, the RP has so far not proven to be a very good predictor of movement onset. It is a predictor. I don't want to say, I don't mean to say that it's not, that it has no predictive power at all, but it's not a very good predictor. So if it reflected the brain getting ready to move, you'd expect it to be a good predictor, and it's not. So I'm going to, for the remainder of the talk, discuss some alternative accounts of the RP, give you an idea of where we're at in terms of trying to understand what the RP reflects, and then suggest some ways forward. One account that my colleagues and I put forward a number of years ago is an account based on random fluctuations in brain activity. We know that brain activity undergoes slow random fluctuations even when you're doing pretty much nothing. And that's including in motor areas of the brain. And so one possible explanation for the RP is that if we imagine this red line here to be a threshold for the onset of movement in the motor system, the precise moment at which when the imperative to move is weak or absent, when we don't specify with a stimulus when to move, then the precise moment at which this threshold is crossed is at least partly determined by these sub-threshold fluctuations in brain activity. And so if we time lock to the moment at which the threshold is crossed, we may recover the characteristic signature of the noise rather than something that is a genuine reflection of the brain getting ready to move. So we modeled that process using a stochastic accumulator. Equation of motion is given here. And what we found in short is that this, this process climbs up closer to the threshold and then fluctuates randomly until at some random moment it crosses the threshold. If we look at the distribution of first crossing times of the threshold, it matches the distribution of waiting times in a task like Libet's very well, how long subjects choose to wait before they randomly perform a movement. And if we average together the trajectory of the decision variable as it's approaching that threshold, we reproduce very nicely the shape, the average shape at least, of the readiness potential. So this suggests, this interpretation suggests that the readiness potential doesn't reflect the outcome of a decision, doesn't reflect a decision to move. It reflects the process perhaps of coming to a decision, or part of that process. That in this case that role is played partly by noise because of the task itself, because you're asked to move at sort of random times. That may be one way that the brain solves that particular task. So according to the stochastic accumulator account, this early part of the readiness potential is accounted for by spontaneous random fluctuations in brain activity, and then somewhere relatively close to the onset of movement, and roughly at the time that Libet's subjects reported being conscious, by the way, of their decision to move, is when the actual commitment to move happens, followed by the very late part of the readiness potential, which is accounted for by motor activity. There are a couple of related accounts. One that we are working on right now involves motor rehearsal. The idea here is that in a task like Libet, subjects literally at a sub-threshold level rehearse doing the movement, or consider sort of, well, maybe I'll move now, maybe not. Maybe I'll move now, maybe not. Maybe I'll move now. And so there are represented in blue here these little motor impulses that are sub-threshold, but when they're superimposed on the underlying fluctuations in brain activity, occasionally the combined, or the combination of the motor impulse and the underlying fluctuations crosses the threshold, and at that moment you move. And if we average these together, we can also reproduce the shape of the readiness potential quite well.
Aaron, you have about 5 minutes left, just to let you know.
Great, okay. So what's another potential account of the readiness potential is in terms of anticipation. We know, for example, of a well-known cortical phenomenon called the stimulus preceding negativity that reflects anticipation of a stimulus, no movement necessary. So here is an experiment where subject spontaneously presses a button. We see a nice readiness potential, and then waits, knowing that after a fixed amount of time, a stimulus will appear, and we see a very similar buildup that reflects merely anticipation, because in this part of the task, the subject is not performing any movement. We've come up with a task that tries to control for anticipation and used machine learning to try to predict the onset of movement in advance. When we don't control for anticipation, you can see in 3 sample subjects here, we're able to predict quite well in advance. But when we do control for anticipation, that our ability to predict falls dramatically down to chance until right around the time of movement, suggesting that anticipation might account for a lot of the variance here in the pre-movement period of time. So what is the readiness potential? Well, again, I'd like to say we don't yet know. We are exploring different possible interpretations of the readiness potential. And I think 3 important points I'll make about the way forward. One is we should recognize that free decisions, free does not mean free from influence. We should try to overcome the cortex, what I call the cortex bias, and move to time unlocked methods. So we know, for example, that if you waited a long time on the previous trial, you tend to wait a longer time on the current trial. Subjects tend to move in Libet's task. They tend to prefer to move at the bottom of the clock for whatever reason. And more recently, Park et al. Showed evidence that subjects prefer to move at the at a certain point in the breathing cycle. So these are constraints. It's not as if your movement is completely free. We have some predictive power over when you might move even in a free context, but what we're interested in here and what we should be focusing on are the residuals, right? What's left over after we've accounted for these deterministic factors. Another important point is that with the techniques that we tend to use for studying the readiness potential, like EEG, MEG, and ECOG, we're primarily sensitive to cortical sources, relatively insensitive to deep structures like the basal ganglia. We need to also record from those deep structures because we know that they're involved in the process. And this has been exemplified by 2 recent papers by Kalaginijad, who looked at these subcortical structures and their role, in particular the basal ganglia and basal forebrain. And finally, my last slide, we should move rather than time locking to the onset of a movement, which, as I've pointed out, is problematic, move toward time unlocked methods where we consider the entire time series rather than looking at the probability of the signal. Given a movement at time 0, we try to examine the probability of a movement at times in the future given the signal now. This is something that we can use to try and discern what kind of process is underlying the pre-movement neural activity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That was fascinating. So I think we have about 5 minutes of questions, and what we'll do now is the speakers will have a 5-minute panel. So speakers, do you have questions for Aaron?
So I have
Walter.
a question. Uri, did you want to go first? I don't care.
Go ahead, Walter.
I'm the philosopher in this group, so I want to ask Aaron, what interests people in Libet is, largely at least, the implications for free will and moral responsibility. And I want to know whether your stochastic accumulator model says anything about that, because if it's really random fluctuations in my brain activity that I have no control over, sounds like, then how is your model going to be any better at securing free will and moral responsibility than Libet's original interpretation?
Right, that's a good question. And the answer is that it doesn't. It doesn't secure free will and moral responsibility. The model is really meant to account for what happens in a task like Libet's, where there's no particular reason to move at any given time. You're asked to sort of intentionally, quote unquote, be spontaneous. The idea is that those underlying spontaneous random fluctuations play an increasing role as the imperative to move gets weaker. But when the imperative to move is stronger, that is when you have reasons to do what you're doing, then they should play less of a role. So they're not, it would be a mistake to confuse this idea and say that, you know, spontaneous fluctuations account for everything that we do. They play a role in the initiation of movement. They may play a role in fixing the precise time at which we move, and they play more of a role in a context where that precise time is not dictated by reasons or inputs, external inputs.
Okay, if I may then, I have a more, I'm not a philosopher, so I have a more specific question, I guess. So, you know, you say we should move to like unlocked methods, right? Not time locking anymore. Do you get a sense from what you've done so far about what we would see? I mean, you said something about maybe maybe we'll be able to predict things much later. Do you have anything to suggest what will happen then?
Well, I suspect that my guess is that what we'll see is that the determinants of the onset of movement come far later in time than the readiness potential would have us believe. That what those time unlocked methods give us is they allow us to sidestep the bias that's inherent in using time locked methods, where again, I stress it's the same system that's generating the signal is also determining the time that you time lock to. So there's at least a risk there that your signal will be biased.
Hey, Aaron.
Yeah.
One quick question. This is maybe straying a little bit, but do you see an application in the results? For example, taking this to something like AI or whatnot, could some of your results then have an impact in that field?
That's a good question. I hadn't really thought about whether or not these results might have an impact in AI. I guess there may be points at which, you know, if you think of AI as in the domain of decision making, so decision systems, where there's some symmetry, and you have to break the symmetry because the decision is not well specified, or where there's a, you know, the AI reaches a point where it can't decide. Maybe that could be a way to break the symmetry and come up with a decision when the alternatives are equal in some on some dimension. Other than that, I'm not sure I can think of any way in which it would, off the top of my head, it might be useful in AI.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next speaker now. Our second speaker is Dr. Uri Maoz, who is an assistant professor of computational neuroscience at the Institute for Interdisciplinary Brain and Behavior Sciences at Chapman University. He is a visiting assistant professor at the Department of Anesthesiology at the David Griffin School of Medicine and at the Anderson School of Management at UCLA. And he is also a visiting associate in biology and bioengineering at Caltech. Welcome to the stage, Uri.
Thank you. Right, let me start by sharing my screen here. So yeah, I'll talk about the role of consciousness in deliberate decisions following Aaron's talk. And I'll start with a similar situation where you're asked to raise your hand, but in this case, instead of when you would raise your hand, you're thinking about, let's say, which hand you would want to raise. So intuitively, what you think would happen is, you think about it at some point, you go, okay, I'm going to raise my, I don't know, my left hand or right hand. And then it's your experience that that decision causally leads you to raise that hand. So the order of events as you experience them is that there is an onset of a conscious decision. You would, I guess, then expect at some point later to see some kind of information in the brain, right? And then you'd see movement onset. But as Aaron told us already in the Libet experiment, we see this movement onset, we see the readiness potential, the information exists in the brain, so supposedly here, and people report the decision onset, this W time, only around here. So there seems to be this mismatch between perhaps what is our intuitive experience of what should happen and what happens in the Libet experiment, with this information existing in the brain before the onset of the conscious decision. And as Aaron discussed already, there's this question, wait a minute, what's going on here, where it seems that there's information in the brain about an action, but the subjects have not yet reported that that they decided. So, you know, was the decision already made unconsciously? Just to clarify, and I think Aaron said this, some of this already, but these results, the Libet results, are not a fluke. Okay, they do replicate. People have looked into whether you're going to move your left hand or your right hand, and you can see some kind of readiness potential. Then there's a famous result by Sinnott et al. From the lab of John Dylan Haynes in Berlin, where they showed that you can you have some information about which hand the person would raise up to about 10 seconds in advance using fMRI. I mean, this information is limited. It's only about 60% accuracy, but there is some information. And there's this study that Aaron already mentioned from Fried et al. About single neuron. So I want to go in a little bit into the argument there of like what happened since Libet. How did the inference of what Libet did and how others perhaps as well as Libet took his results, what they took it to mean. So what Libet found was that the readiness potential precedes the reported decision onset. From that, it seems that he took this to mean that decisions, at least in the Libet experiments, were made unconsciously. And I mean, this he did already in the original 1983 paper, where it had like, kind of like the subtitle of the unconscious initiation of a freely voluntary act. Later on, he and I think others have kind of started saying, well, maybe generally decisions are made unconsciously. And again, already in 1985, he talks more generally about like decisions being made unconsciously. And this is where things get, you know, if decisions generally are made unconsciously, then it seems that it leaves no role for consciousness in decision-making. And this really challenges social pillars, free will, moral responsibility, some economic theories, and so on. So, I mean, Aaron already talked about some challenges to this, this inference here. I'd like to talk a bit more about more challenges. So for this to be interesting, I would say, at least for the result, the Libet result to be interesting, it would need to hold in real time. I mean, what we are maybe worried about is, you know, I'm sitting here trying to think which hand I would raise, and this nefarious neuroscientist can look into my brain and they know what I'm about to do, and I don't even know it yet. What might be less worrying is if I told you, well, the neuroscientist can look at your, can record the data from your brain, go to the lab, analyze it for 3 months, then come back and say, oh, I would have known what you were about to do 3 months ago. So I would say that it's interesting if we can do these things in real time. It's also, I mean, in real time, it's much harder to cheat yourself with like some kind of statistics that don't go the right way or whatever it is. The other thing is about early prediction signals. So there's this question of, okay, this signal that we see, and again, Aaron already talked about the readiness potential as that, but is it really an early determination? So has the decision been determined and we're just waiting for something to move? Or is it just some kind of bias, some kind of, I mean, it's predictive, but it's not that the decision has been determined. So these two things bear here, while this third thing bears in this transition here. The Libet experiments do investigate these arbitrary decisions. You raise your right hand, you raise your left hand. In some sense, who cares? You're just breaking the symmetry, right? So do they really, do they generalize to decisions that matter? You know, this job or that job, life partners, things like that really matter in life. Do they generalize to that? So I'll be talking about these three things here. So the first question, are decisions decodable from brain activity online and in real time? I'll mention work that we've done a few years back, we wanted to look at people raising their left or right hand. We wanted to give them also a little bit of a reason to do that. So we created this matching pennies scenario where it's kind of like a two-choice version of rock, paper, scissors. So if I was playing this with you, we would go 1, 2, 3, go, and we would each raise a hand. And let's say if we raise the same hand, then maybe you win. And if we raise different hands, then I win. So we played this with our subjects 50 cents per round. And our subjects were epilepsy patients implanted with electrodes for clinical purposes. Now, what we also did is we created this real-time system that we took information from their brain, we analyzed it immediately, and it's hard to see here, but I'm wearing these earphones. And actually, even though I'm supposedly playing against the subject, we are actually, I'm actually just waiting for a beep telling me which hand to raise. So this is, this is a general sketch of this real-time system, and and I can show you what it looks like. So there's a countdown, and then at some point there was a click, and you saw an arrow, and that happens before we raise our hands. So it's a few hundred milliseconds before we raise our hands. I get a click telling me which hand to raise. And I use that basically to beat the subject. And you can see this happening again. You hear the click before we do anything. Now, we were relatively successful here. We were able to predict which hand the subject would raise at above 80% accuracy. So I guess I would go back here and I would say, well, yes, actually this thing is okay, it's fulfilled. We can decode decision from brain activity. So online and in real time. So let's move on to the second question about this early prediction signals. What are they really? Are they, do the early prediction signals really reflect the determination? Because, okay, one option is, the early prediction signals, they could be indicative, as I said, of the early determination of the decision. So the decision has already been made. You're just now waiting to act it out. So then if that's the case, all the information is there in the brain, and then with some future technology, better neuroimaging, more fancy machine learning, we would be able to at least potentially get to 100% accuracy, maybe a few seconds in advance of predicting, let's say, which hand a person would raise. The other option, if these early signals are really just probabilistic, so they don't determine anything, there may be a bias or something like that, then even if we had the best technology in the world and we were recording all the neurons in your brain and everything else that matters, we would still not be able to predict you at 100% because you have not really made up your mind. It's just some bias. So what we did was we took a temporal discounting task. In humans, it's usually something like, do you want $1 now or $5, I don't know, a few hours from now? But we did a reanalysis of some monkey work by Dale Lee from Yale. So he asked the monkeys, do you want less juice now or more juice later? And the way the experiment goes is that the monkey is sitting there, and what we were interested in, so the monkey is sitting there, at some point they get some symbols, the stimulus that tells them less juice, when is going to be the less juice, when is going to be the more juice, and so on. What we cared about is what happens before they even get the stimulus. So they're just sitting there and they're waiting. They don't know what are going to be the rewards, what are going to be the what's going to be on the left, on the right side of the screen. They're just sitting there and waiting, and we're recording their brain activity. And we see these neurons, or we saw these neurons that could predict what the monkey would do. And I'll explain a bit more when they could predict it and so on. But they can predict, let's say, that the monkey has a bias or favors going to the left, let's say right now. And then if the left happens to be less juice now rather than more juice later, then that's what the monkey would end up doing, or at least is more likely to end up doing. And we saw these in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. We saw both neurons that favor left or right. And we saw some neurons like that, spatial neurons like that, bias neurons in the ventral striatum as well. We also saw in the DLPFC what we call reward bias neurons. So sometimes they favored large reward or small reward. So the way we see this, and it also kind of works well with some of the things that Aaron was discussing. This seems to be a small bias. So if the monkey is asked, do you want a small reward now or a large reward now? and they would probably take the large reward now, right? And the bias is typically not able to overcome that preference. However, if you're asked, do you want a small reward now and a large reward sometime later, where you're more indifferent, you know, you're kind of 50-50, then the bias that we see, this bias that we see before you even see the decision alternatives, before you see the stimulus, that could really tip the scales. Just to say, I mean, we developed this circuit model, but I don't think I'm going to talk too much about it here. You can read about it more if you want to, which really, I mean, put all these ideas into like mathematical formulation. But the conclusions are that this bias activity predicts the choices when the values of the decision alternatives are similar. And it predicts it before deliberation can even begin. I would say, I mean, interestingly, just as an aside, sometimes the monkeys were asked, do you want a small reward now or a large reward now? And they actually chose the small reward, which you would think is a mistake. Interestingly, in those trials, the bias was especially large. So it sometimes seems to have an effect also in when the alternatives are divergent. So at least in this experiment, and this setting, this kind of early pre-deliberation activity in the brain is really a bias. It only gives you probabilistic information about the future choices. And it seems to favor this idea of the decisions not being determined early. So going back to this, I mean, I'm not going to say that this is compelling evidence that, you know, in the Libet experiments and everywhere else, that early prediction signals, they don't reflect decisions, but it seems to point in that direction, that at least under some circumstances, we can see early predictive signals that are not, it's not that the decision has been made, it's just that there is some bias in the brain. So let's, I want to last talk about this part, about whether the Libet results really generalize from arbitrary to deliberate decisions. This is more recent work with Liad Mudrik from Tel Aviv University, Christoph Koch, who was then at Caltech, now at the Allen Institute, and Gideon Yeffi from Yale. So what we wanted to do in this experiment is really compare directly arbitrary and deliberate decisions. The way we did this was by looking at, well, we told people that we were giving them $1,000 that they can donate to a nonprofit. And actually, for one subject, one of their decisions was translated into a $1,000 donation. This was not fake. And we swore before them that it's not fake to make them understand it's a real decision. And then, so some of these nonprofits were things that people tend to support, the Hunger Project, cancer research, and things like that. Others were meant to be controversial, pro-life, pro-choice, anti-guns, pro-guns, and so on. And then sometimes people made easy decisions, sometimes they made hard decisions. The way we did that was before the whole experiment started, we had people look at each one of those nonprofits and say on a scale of 1 to 7 how much they want to support it. And 7 was I really want to give them $1,000. 1 was absolutely not. So in a hard decision, it might have been something, let's say that had a 5 for that subject versus something that maybe had a 6. So that's a hard decision. And an easy decision is maybe something that had a 2 versus something that had a 7 or something like that. So these were for deliberate decisions. Now for, I mean, subjects press something on the screen, and if they press the button on the left, then the NPO on the left would get the donation, and so on. Now for arbitrary decisions, the subjects pressed the same things on the screen. They saw the same things. I mean, they saw the same stimulus. They made the same action. However, this time, no matter which button they pressed, both nonprofits got $500. So that's how we made it an arbitrary decision. So, well, what happened in terms of the behavioral manipulation? Did it work? So yes, it did. We can see that for deliberate decisions, this is the reaction time in hard decisions, the reaction time in easy decisions, and we can see that the deliberate here in red take a longer time for people to decide than the arbitrary ones, as you'd expect. We can also see that harder decisions take longer. They'll be below the diagonal than easy decisions for deliberate, but we don't see any difference for arbitrary. And also, if we look at consistency, so if you got something that was a 2 versus a 7, we'd expect, I mean, you rated a 2 versus a 7, and before the experiment, we'd expect you to take the thing that you rated a 7. So we can see that for easy decisions, the consistency was almost perfect. For hard decisions, the consistency was about 80%. And then for arbitrary decisions, the consistency was around 50%, as you'd expect. Okay, so the behavioral manipulation worked. If we look at the neuroimaging data, we recorded EEG during this experiment. So we can see for arbitrary decisions, this kind of downward inflection, like a readiness potential, but we don't really see much for deliberate decisions. This is, every subject here is in a different color. And if we look at things on average, we can see this nice readiness potential for arbitrary decisions, but nothing much for deliberate decisions. We ran various control analyses to make sure that this is not due to the reaction time differences, to differences in eye movements, to stimulus lock, to EEG activity, to the hand that people use, to filtering methods, and everything else that our kind reviewers suggested that we should check. It's not easy to say that something is not happening. Now, and none of those showed that they could explain our results. Another interesting thing there is that we looked at something called the lateralized readiness potential. Now, the lateralized readiness potential is more related to actual movement. So because the movements in arbitrary and deliberate decisions were the same, we actually expected the lateralized readiness potential before movement onset, so in this part, to be the same between arbitrary and deliberate decisions. And we see that it is the same, which we thought was nice. One more thing that we did was we took the Schurger model that Aaron just talked about, and we extended it both to easy and hard decisions and to the arbitrary and deliberate situation. And we, again, in a similar manner as Aaron described to you before, we first of all, we fit the reaction time distributions, and I mean, we fit them relatively well. And then after that, we looked at what the model predicts, and we saw that the model really predicts this kind of like a slow downward trend that we saw in deliberate decisions, but this kind of like a readiness potential, well, not like a readiness potential basically for arbitrary decisions. So the models seem to work well with our data. So, well, what we took from that is that the neural signals that are associated with arbitrary decisions don't generalize, at least in our experiment, do not generalize to deliberate decisions. So, I mean, if, you know, people think that deliberate results pose some kind of a threat to volition, so perhaps, but it doesn't seem to generalize. This threat does not seem to generalize to deliberate decisions. And I would argue, again, as I said before, that the deliberate decisions are one that we care more about. Certainly, if you think about things like moral responsibility, nobody's going to take you to court because you raised your right hand instead of your left hand for no reason and for no purpose. If that thing actually had some moral value, well, that's different. And then it becomes more of a deliberate decision. And I would maybe say that then the onus is on those who think that the deliberate results do hold for meaningful deliberate decisions to demonstrate that they do hold, not just kind of assume that they do. Going back to this kind of inference that I talked about here, so I think this does provide relatively compelling results that deliberate experiments do not, at least immediately, generalize from arbitrary to deliberate decisions. And to conclude, I would say that the Libet experiments do not seem to provide compelling evidence that consciousness has no causal role in decision making, especially decisions that matter, deliberate decisions. So, I mean, that we don't think that those are made unconsciously, at least from what we've seen. And I think that the neuroscience of volition should move, and is moving, away from, or beyond, I would say, Libet. And among other things, it's looking now more into deliberate decisions. I would like to acknowledge the help of various colleagues at Caltech, at UCLA, and now various people in the lab at Chapman, including Aaron. It was not a mistake. We are in the same place, which is a lot of fun, at least for me. And thank you very much. I would end here.
Okay.
All right. I have a, are we open for questions?
I am.
Jay, yeah. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, I have a question, which is so these data about arbitrary and deliberate decisions, what do you think they say about, or what do they add to our understanding of what the RP reflects, especially in light of the fact that we get the RP in very simple creatures, creatures that probably aren't capable of manifesting any difference between arbitrary or deliberate decisions. So I guess that would suggest that maybe decisions in those simple creatures are not deliberate. They're not capable. They're not capable of that kind of decision.
So the way we actually extended your model in the paper was that we assumed that deliberate decisions are also made using some kind of a drift diffusion model. But again, in a drift diffusion model, you can have deliberate decisions, right? Because you have this parameter of you can call it urgency or something, and you can say that, let's say if you have a lot of evidence that you should go to the right and not to the left, you can have like a race to threshold between two different decision alternatives, one of them with a very strong imperative and the other one with a very weak one. So then the strong one is going to win. But we had this idea that the deliberate decisions would be made in a different part of the brain, and they would not be recorded by the CZ electrode, like the typical place where you see the readiness potential. So and again, when you do that, you can see the kind of results that we get from basically an extension of your model. So I think what I would say is that at least the way we modeled it, the arbitrary and the deliberate decisions are made in different places in the brain. So if you're asking about lower animals, it could be. I mean, where we would assume that you would see things like deliberate decisions, or maybe the ventromedial prefrontal cortex or places like that have been implicated in economic decision making. So I would assume that if maybe you're an animal that does not have that, then maybe your ability to do things that are more deliberate are at least differently manifested. I mean, even very low animals can still, or low, if you want to call them that, animals can still, right? Like if something's happening here, they would steer away from that. So I don't know that they cannot make deliberate decisions, it would be interesting to see whether those decisions are there for meaningful decisions. Whether the RP is there for meaningful decisions for them and not just for more arbitrary ones. And you might know the literature better about these animals, what kind of decisions were exactly tested on them. But that would be a prediction would be that maybe we wouldn't get it for. I mean, if it was just a spontaneous decision versus if it was something that was more meaningful, perhaps.
Eve, why don't you go ahead? You had to go first time, so mix up the order.
You go, Walter.
Okay. Just wanted to give you a chance. My question's about the arbitrary and deliberate experiment at the end, because you seem to draw out implications for the role of consciousness, but you didn't test for consciousness. So I'm not sure what the experiment really shows about the role of consciousness. It seems to be a kind of a negative conclusion that, maybe consciousness is not playing any role in arbitrary decisions, but it could still play a role in deliberate decisions. But the experiment doesn't show that it plays any role, does it? What exactly are the implications of that experiment for the role of consciousness in decision making?
So I guess there are two things to say. One is people have taken the Libet experiment to suggest that consciousness plays no role in any kind of decisions. And I think our experiment challenges that claim. It says, well, again, if there's a role, if there is no role for, well, let's put it this way, the Libet results as they are do not seem to generalize to deliberate decisions. So whatever kind of claims you want to make based on the Libet experiments, I don't know that you can make them for deliberate decisions. But in that sense, you're correct, Walter, that it is more of a negative. It's like yeah. The second thing is, you could argue, again, this is, you may or may not agree with this, but you could argue that consciousness is more involved in deliberate decisions than it is in arbitrary ones. If I just tell you raise one of your hands for no reason and no purpose, you can do it. But if I tell you now, if you raise your right hand, something really important would happen. If you raise your left hand, something else that's really important would happen. Decide which one and raise your hand now to indicate that. Then arguably you would be more consciously engaged with the second decision. So perhaps if you're more consciously engaged, we see less of this readiness potential. But again, this requires this assumption that consciousness is more involved in deliberate decisions. It may seem plausible, but we don't have, I'm not exactly sure how you measure consciousness, and you can show that there's more consciousness in A than there is in B in these settings, not in like when a patient is sitting in a bed and they are or not conscious. I don't know how satisfying that is, Walter, but hopefully it's some answer.
I'm raising my hand because we have to move on to our next speaker now. So our next speaker is Isham, Assistant Professor of Cognition and Neurosystems in the Department of Psychology at the University of Arizona. She is also a faculty member of the Cognitive Science Graduate Interdisciplinary Program at U of A. She is the director of the Consciousness Action Time Lab, and I'm excited to welcome Eve to the stage. Welcome, Eve.
Thank you. Let's see, I'll put up my slide. Is the audio okay?
Yep, you're great.
Okay, thank you. All right. So the focus of my talk is we're going to explore together some of the possible roles of subjective temporal experience in decision making. Uri and Aaron have already introduced you to the Libet paradigm. For me, my focus is actually on one of the components in that paradigm and what they call time W. The term time W refers to this idea that when you're doing the task, the Libet's a simple key press or wrist flexion, you would be able to report back the time in which you feel like you have this decisional urge to act. I call it W because that's what Libet called it, but this term has already been mentioned in Aaron and Uri's talk as well. Another thing to emphasize with regards to time W is that since Libet, this time W has been used and assumed that it reflects the earliest moment of consciousness. And so it sort of serves as, on the assumption that for this discussion, I'm going to assume for a second that W is the index of the earliest moment of consciousness. I want to explore whether or not this time W means anything. I want to see whether or not time W plays some role. And again, because on the assumption that it serves serves as a potential index for consciousness, could this be where if we study W, we might actually ultimately understand a little bit of what consciousness does, what its role might be, what its purpose might be. Before I get there, I just want to take note really quickly that just like the Libet paradigm as a whole, W does have, did receive a lot of criticisms as well. Some of the things that we did, myself and my graduate advisor, Bill Banks, we did look at W together, and we actually thought that, using the Libet type task, we found that W is in fact inferred. In other words, W can be biased by some random event that comes after the action has already taken place. In that experiment, which will be relevant a little bit later, I'm going to call it the tone manipulation. We actually had people perform the Libet task. They received a tone that comes afterwards. the tone was systematically delayed, and time W would shift in the direction of the tone in a similar fashion as you would see in something like a temporal binding or intentional binding task. So in that sense, we already kind of figured out that, okay, whatever this W experience is, it's actually very subjective and it can be biased. And another relevant point to make here for you to keep in mind is that W is also not correlated with the RP, and has been found that by Patrick Haggard and his colleagues, suggesting that W may not be meaningful. But what I'm trying to explore today is to see whether or not W, as whatever this is, and I'm going to call it, I'm going to say that it is the subjective experience, it's a temporal subjective experience. Could it nevertheless still play some role? Okay, so we're not talking about the true W, we're not talking about veridical W, we're just talking about, if you do end up having this W experience, when you realize, hey, this is the temporal moment, this is the timing in which I feel an onset of decision, does that mean anything? Does that do anything? Okay, so when Libet did the experiment, he found that the onset of the readiness potential roughly between minus 500 milliseconds, so 500 milliseconds to 1,000 milliseconds before key press, that came on and precede the timing of W. Okay, and this latency between the onset of the RP and the time W actually had motivated one of the leading interpretations, and that interpretation is that really consciousness doesn't really have a function, that conscious will is simply an illusion. So it has no causal role in thought or behavior. Several scholars have advocated this idea, including Dan Wagner here. But Libet came along and said, hey, if you're going to try to understand the function of the role of consciousness, why look at that temporal window? Why are we looking at that moment, that period in which you're not conscious? If you're interested in the function of consciousness, look at a different time window in which we are conscious and see what it does. So instead of that time window, Libet suggested that we should look at this other time window that corresponds to time W and extending it to the motor response time. So time WM, the time period that I'm going to call WMR. Libet called this the Vita window. So he gave it a functional name to suggest that this time window is the period of time in which you use to deliberate and cancel any actions that were initiated unconsciously. So when you have this window, you have this opportunity, roughly about 200 milliseconds, to actually change your mind to cancel what has already been initiated. I want to call it WMR just in case that the WMR window, in case this time window is not really for vetoing, maybe it's meant for something else. And ask this question. So this first question for this talk, is this window, the WMR window, really a deliberation period that Libet had intended? Is it really a time and place for us to veto that? So that's one of the questions to ask, and then there'll be another question surrounding W itself in terms of what its role, alternative roles might be with decision making. Okay, so for this first task, we wanted to explore this WMR window to see if it really is a period for deliberation or cancellation of veto. And in order to do this experiment, we also kind of share the same sentiment as Uri here, that we couldn't really use the Libet task, the straight up traditional Libet task. It's too simple of a task. It doesn't have any consequences. It's just, if you will, the term arbitrary that Uri had used as well. So you just kind of sit there and press the button. So instead, we modified the Libet task and had people perform a decision-making task where they either agree or disagree with a series of statements that were presented to them verbally while they're looking at the clock, just like the traditional Libet task. And the statements that we gave people varied in terms of difficulty. So let me give you some examples. What's on the screen, one of the examples we use is, I believe in free will. There were other statements like, I like red more than blue, and I would sacrifice a child to save the village. So you could see that there's different degrees here of consequences, as well as different degrees of decisional difficulty, right? One statement could be very difficult, and the other could be easier to agree or disagree with. And we asked participants to perform this task. Here's the trial structure. I'll just kind of briefly run through this. They received the statement auditorily. They either have to agree or disagree. They don't do anything just yet in terms of behavioral output, but they're supposed to sort of consider it. And then they note time W and keep that in their working memory, just like the Libet task. And then when they finally are sure of what decision they choose, either agree or disagree, they would press one of the two buttons indicating agree or disagree. So we have a motor response, and they then report time W. What time was it that you felt the onset of decision? And then they also provide us with the difficulty ratings. How difficult were you to make that decision on scale of 1 to 5? What we found from this, actually before I show you that, going into the experiment, we had a couple of hypotheses to try to test this WMR window. If it were true that this is a period of time where you actually cancel when you veto and things like that, we thought that then when it's an easy decision to make, perhaps you won't have to deliberate very much, right? So you wouldn't take too much time in this WMR window to really have to deliberate. Whereas if it's a more difficult decision, then you would require more time. So the WMR window would be longer. So that was one hypothesis going in. Another alternative hypothesis to that would be more like a null hypothesis, where this is where you just kind of switch between agree or disagree, but without really thinking about it, but you can still veto the action. So in that sense, the WMR window would be the same for both easy and difficult. So going in to this experiment, we had these two hypotheses. This is what we found. On the top graph, we have the bar graph. That's simply just a manipulation check. So I just want to point it out real quick that when we look at just the completion time for the entire trial, on average, people took longer time in general to perform a difficult decision, so that's longer. And then when it's an easy trial, an easy decision, on average, people perform using a shorter period of time. So that's more of like a manipulation check. The focus and the interest data, though, lies here in the WMR window. So what you're looking at time 0, that's the moment when you actually press the button to either agree or disagree. And from there, you're looking at the WMR in, backward reference from that point. And you can see here, it's actually inconsistent with the two hypotheses that we went into it with. And what we found here is that the WMR window for easy is actually longer, and the WMR period for the difficult decision is actually shorter. Take note also that the duration or the length of the WMR period for the EC trial is about 150 milliseconds, for here, and that's very similar to what Libet typically finds. It's a range of about 120 to 200 milliseconds. Okay, but we want to be able to explain this, and we want to know whether or not this means anything, and why why we didn't meet the hypotheses that we came in with, and what does that mean in terms of what the function that the WMR serves. Okay, so we had several speculations. The one that probably most relevant to this discussion today is the difference in the way that we approach decision-making when it's an easy decision versus when it's a difficult decision. For easy decision, we speculate that perhaps this is very similar to if you were to perform a Libet type style decision where you're just kind of pressing the button. This kind of decision would be a little bit more automatic. If it's not fully automatic, it's close to it, where if it's something that you have thought about before and easy to make, you can easily come up with the decision almost immediately. And by having come up with it automatically, or one might say unconsciously, you may need some time to then deliberate a little bit more. And just to give you a concrete example, one of our statements is, I like red more than blue. Several of our participants reported verbally to us afterwards, and when we talked with them, they would say things like, okay, I generally like red more than blue, and I could agree with that, and that would be an easy decision to make for me. However, I did have to think a little bit about it, because there would be some situations when I prefer blue more than red. But ultimately I choose what I originally had. So that could be a scenario where you could potentially have an early W to begin with, but why you have a longer WMR window is because the decision kind of comes to you a little bit more automatically, and then you spend the rest of the time deliberating of whether or not you agree with that initial decision. And that would be consistent with what Libet had proposed. Now, what about the WMR for the difficult window? Why is it shorter? And again, same speculation, but kind of like the opposite, the mirror reflection of that is that when it's a difficult trial, your approach toward making such a decision requires that you think a little bit. Now you're actually using you're engaging in the decision more consciously, more effortfully, right? So, and it's possible that the reason in the data that we see WMR window to be shorter is because there's a ramp up, there's a build up of making a decision, but you don't realize, you don't have that onset of a decision until much later. So by the time you realize that you have a decision finally, you have already thought about it, you have already deliberated enough to where this WMR window is really not necessarily needed, right? So you will have the WMR window simply just to maybe choose which button to press. So that's one speculation off of this. And to refer back to what function does WMR serve? Well, I think partially it would agree with Libet from the EC decision perspective. That may be consistent with what Libet had in mind. But then when it is a different type of decisions, in our case, we have an example from the difficult trials, but maybe when it's a different type of decisions, this could vary. And this is for us a work in progress. So we can't just kind of like really confidently, fully 100% say that this is the case, but we're thinking that this WMR window can play a role and may provide more information about what consciousness serves, but we just need to do more research on it. Another thing I want to add that is interesting is, and this is a little bit different from maybe what Uri found, but I think this opens up to a little bit more discussion later on, is that we did look at this experiment, but in a different set of participants where we actually recorded the RP. And what we found is that for those EC decisions represented here by the black waveform, that seemed to be consistent with it's RP looking. So it's suggesting that we do have an RP for easy decisions, but for difficult trials, we actually didn't really see it. This particular finding, this unpublished data that we have, seem to support the idea that the EC trials are probably very similar to what Libet has, similar to the Libet task. Based on this alone, this also gives us another direction of research that we are pursuing. Unfortunately, we don't have we have not analyzed the data fully yet, but one thing that I want to show is that we are looking at various types of decision-making in comparison to the Libet task. We are looking at the RP as well as other ERP components. What I'm showing here simply is just the RP, and this is certainly something that are in the works right now. So we are looking at the Libet task, and the Libet task generates the RP just like how other previous findings have reported. But when it comes to something that perhaps more relevant or real world based, moral decision making, such like the ones that that I have just presented just a few slides back, or something like a math decision, even though it's not necessarily subjective and more and the performance can be objectively quantified here, we don't see an RP. We are planning on breaking this up again, according to this easy versus difficult, and then we are looking at also ERP components after the decisions have made as well. But I just wanted to put this in to let you know that there's definitely this effort, and I agree with Uri earlier, the point that he made earlier as well, that I think we do need to look at other decision types that's beyond the limit in order to really address the role of consciousness. Okay, so that's part of the idea of the veto window that Libet proposed. But what about alternative potential roles for time W? What we looked into is, again, this idea that perhaps consciousness doesn't have a function, doesn't have a causal role at all. Wagner proposed this theory, and many people advocate for this as well, but he did essentially modify this a little bit. And his perspective, the modified perspective, is that this experience of conscious will or consciousness may actually have a purpose, may have a social purpose that guide or modify future behaviors, future thoughts and things like that. And there are other scholars that share the same view. So for us, for the next part of the discussion here is that for my lab, we are interested in whether or not this time W, again, it's the subjective time, well, not time veridical W, but this W experience, this time of having this onset of a decision, could that somehow shape future thoughts and behaviors? Putting in the experimental context, it's best to keep it kind of short in terms of our experiment. So we looked at basically a very similar trial structure as what we did earlier in the experiment that I mentioned earlier. So participants came in and performed this task of having to judge whether or not they agree or disagree with the statement, similar to what we did before. But there were a couple of twists, a couple of new conditions that we inserted in the experiment so that we can actually understand whether or not W plays a role. The trial structure is on the left, but just to just give it a quick summary, in the end, we ended up with 4 conditions to compare things with. The participants came in and we divided into 2 groups. The first group is the W report group. This is where we actually asked them to perform a very similar task as earlier, where they actually have to remember what time was it that they had a decision onset, and then they have to report back W. In the no report group, this is the group where we never brought up W. We just let them do the task, and then they just judge for difficulty ratings. They just give us the ratings. So we never brought it to them. And we did ask them at the end to whether or not any timing or any thought related to time or anything like that came up, and at the end of the experiment they would say no. So we have 2 groups here performing either a W report or no W report group, and essentially we want to be able to compare those 2 groups to see if this plays a role on difficulty ratings. The other thing that we had to do in order to show that W plays a role, we had to manipulate W. And this is the tone manipulation that Bill Banks and I used in the past to show that W could be shifted around. So briefly, when there is no tone, you could treat that as if they were performing like a Libet task. So that's sort of like our baseline task. When there's a tone, in our case, we use a tone that was delayed about 40 milliseconds, and that should shift W forward, making the feeling of the onset of a decision late or later compared to the no tone condition. We collected the data, we collected 3 dependent measures. The 2 of interest first are the time W and the difficulty ratings. Both of these are subjective, right? So W, they would tell us what time was it that they felt that decision onset. And then difficulty ratings would be, hey, I felt that, this was easy or difficult on a scale of 1 to 5. And then we have the reaction time or the completion time that people took. For W, the data that we have here are just basically two conditions. We have the W in the delayed and the no tone, in the delayed tone condition and the no tone condition. We don't have, and this is for the the group that reported W. We obviously wouldn't have W data for the no report. So here is more of like a manipulation check. We found that W did vary with the tone manipulation. When there's no tone, then W is earlier. And then when there is a tone that is delayed, W binds to that tone and is inferred from that tone. So this establishes the temporal experience that in the tone condition, people feel that the onset of a decision comes a little bit later. Now, does that though have an impact on difficulty rating? And that's like the heart of the study when we went into this. First, let's look at the difficulty ratings in the W group. So the two bars that are coupled together on the left of this graph in the W report group. What we found, there is a difference in difficulty ratings for those that for the trials that were the tone was delivered and also subsequently were judged as having a late W. The timing, the rating for that is actually higher on the difficulty scale. In other words, when you have a late W, it leads to this belief that the decision is more difficult. When you have the belief that W is earlier, represented by the lighter blue bar, the rating is actually lower. So easier. And this pattern of behavior, this pattern of output is only true. We only observed it in the W report group when they actually were conscious of this temporal time. But when we looked at those in the no W report group, in other words, they weren't aware of time W, they weren't aware of the time of decisional onset here. There's no difference, and this would imply, one interpretation here, this would imply that having W and being alert and aware of this time of having a decision could potentially guide this subsequent judgment of difficulty. And that really supports a hypothesis that we came in with. We also looked at reaction time, and when we look at reaction time, originally we wanted this more of like a manipulation check one more time, and this is just to see whether or not the tone and no tone play a role on reaction time. And in theory, it shouldn't, and it doesn't. The data show here, the data that's shown here suggests that the tone manipulation doesn't have an impact on reaction time, and that's fine. But the interesting thing that we found here too is that there is a difference in the overall reaction time from those two groups of participants. We found that the people in the W report group actually took less time to finish the task compared to those in the no W report group. Of course, there are several speculations to that, but the one that might be relevant to this conversation again is the idea that perhaps this has to do with W. Perhaps this is because when you are attending to the onset time, right? So you are keeping engaged in the passage of time, and you realize that, hey, I have reached a decision here. I have a decision onset. Why do I wait longer? I should just go ahead and make that decision, and that possibly lead to a shorter time to complete the task. So that would be true for the W report group. Alternatively, or in contrast rather, the W group, the group that didn't get to report W, they're not actually super conscious of time passage, nor thinking about the onset of their decision time. So in this group, I speculate that possibly this may, people just kind of keep going and they just keep deliberating or thinking more about the decision, and then ultimately they make that decision, and hence the longer period. This wasn't something that we anticipated going into the experiment. Nevertheless, it may be another evidence that how being aware, being conscious of timing of this time W could play a role as well. But again, the original intention was looking at how W might influence difficulty ratings. And in fact, I think we did observe that.
You
so
have about 5 minutes left.
Oh, thank you. Yes, this is my concluding slide. Thank you, Jay. returning to that question, this was again an examination to looking at possible roles of subjective temporal experience. I used time W that came from the LIBIT task, and I wanted to see whether this time W plays some role. So based on the first set of experiments addressing that veto window, the veto theory, our study have found that, have shown that W may have some role in that, inconsistent with what LIBIT has suggested. But the purpose of this time period, this WMR period, may or may not be just for vetoing or canceling. It might be for something else, or it might be nothing at all, right? And we are just one of a few studies that have looked at it from this perspective. And so I think further investigations obviously is needed. And one of the things that potentially could be done in the future is to examine different types of decisions that are out there, as this time window may vary depending on the kind of decisional approach that one may take. So that's from the first take-home message from the first set of studies there. And then the second set of studies, the one that that deals with manipulating time W and see if that influenced difficulty rating. The idea there is to see whether or not this time W could have some influence on subsequent thoughts and behaviors. I said earlier that, you know, we don't have much time in the lab to really do this kind of thing. And so we look at W and its immediate effect on the judgment of difficulty ratings. But if there's an opportunity to study this further as looking at, for example, in terms of long-term effect, and this could also potentially be beneficial and help provide further insights into some of the roles in which time W and just time in general may help in the context of decision making, what kind of role it would contribute. So I think I'll end there, but before I completely close my slide, I'd like to thank several people that have contributed to this this series of experiments. The top three, Crystal, Camille, and Lara, contributed significantly to the first set of experiments that I mentioned. And Sarah and Javier are working very hard on taking this to the next step and trying to understand what we can do with different types of decision making. And people that are listed here have contributed significant time and conversations, very fruitful conversations, to try to think more about what all of this stuff means. And one last person that I want to mention is my a graduate advisor, Bill Banks, the late Bill Banks. He's no longer with us, but a lot of his ideas and a lot of his contributions in the scientific approach to consciousness, you know, are still applied today. And he has his line of thinking and has really helped me think through all of this. So I always like to thank him for having been there for me and kind of give me this, help me think more scientifically about consciousness. So thank you very much for having me. I'll stop my share now.
All right, thank you so much. You are
Sure.
on timing, actually. So right at 30 minutes. So we will move right into our next and final speaker. Our final speaker is Walter Sinnott-Armstrong, who is the Chancey Stillman Professor of Practical Ethics in the Department of Philosophy and the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University. He is a core faculty in the Duke Institute for Brain Science, the Duke Center for Cognitive Neuroscience, and the Duke Center for Interdisciplinary Decision Sciences. He serves as a resource faculty in the philosophy department of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and is partner investigator at the Oxford Center for Neuroethics, and research scientist with the Mind Research Network at the University of New Mexico, where I used to work. So welcome to the stage, Walter. Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted. We'll try to read your lips.
Unmute.
There you go.
I share, and then I put my screen up, and there. Now, can you hear me?
Yep, you're great, and we can see your slides. Go ahead.
Good. So I'm a philosopher. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to give you quite as much data as all the other people on this panel. I am going to talk about a couple of experiments that I did with the help of some friends who are scientists, but I'm going to wax more philosophical and talk about the larger issue. I take it that the larger issue is, does consciousness cause decisions? And Libet raised this question, but it's a classic question from long ago. I like to refer back to a case that T.H. Huxley brought up in the 19th century of Sergeant F, just to make it kind of concrete and see what motivated the early people who held the view that's now associated more with Libet and Wegner and others that you've heard about. So Sergeant F was in war, hit by a bullet in his parietal lobe, and when he recovered from the injury and went back to a normal life, his health was okay, he was reported to be intelligent and kindly, similar personality to before the injury. But every once in a while, every few weeks, he would transition quite quickly into an abnormal state that would last around a day. And in the abnormal state, he seemed to be unconscious. The evidence that he was unconscious was that they put pins into his body. I don't think the IRB would let us do that anymore, but they stuck pins in his body and he showed no sign of pain. They gave him electric shocks and no sign of pain. And there were other tests of consciousness as well. He seemed to show no sign of consciousness, but he engaged in very complex actions. He would sing and he would pretend to be fighting with his cane like he was having a battle in war. But my favorite was the letters. They would take like 20 sheets of paper and put them in front of him, and he would write on the top, dear friend, I hope you are doing well in the COVID pandemic. And then they would take the top sheet off. And then on the second sheet, he would write, something like, I'm writing to you now to ask whether you might be willing to look at my new book manuscript and provide me with comments. And then they would pull the sheet off. And then he would write, I know this takes a lot of time and you're very busy, but, and then they would take it off. So he'd write a sentence or two and they'd pull the sheet away. And then he'd keep writing on the next sheet as if nothing had happened. He didn't seem to notice that they were taking the sheets away. And when he got to the end, they pulled away the last sheet. And he looked at a blank sheet of paper and corrected mistakes on the sheet of paper. And when they checked, he was actually correcting places on that paper where there were mistakes on the previous pages that they had pulled away. So he seemed to be engaging in very, very complex actions. And yet there was reason to think that he was not conscious at the time that he was doing these things. Now, that's just one case study, and they did similar things with frogs and other animals, but it's hard to get cases for humans. Nonetheless, T.H. Huxley drew the conclusion called epiphenomenalism, which is that the physical events cause mental events, but mental events, including consciousness and will, do not have effects on the physical events themselves. So consciousness for Huxley was like the steam whistle. It gives off a sound and gives off steam, but that's not what drives the locomotive. And Nietzsche adopted this view slightly later, saying that the will no longer moves anything. It merely accompanies events. So that's the epiphenomenalist view. And I take it that that's the kind of lesson that people have been drawing from, at least some people have been drawing from Libet's experiments that we've heard a lot about. This is not about whether the will is free or not. It's about whether consciousness has a causal role in action. And he argued that it doesn't, because the consciousness occurs later at W, and the brain activity that causes the action occurs earlier, which is the RP, so-called. Okay, and the problem is, I agree, like Libet's experiments don't show that. By themselves, they don't show that, because there's a perfectly common sense interpretation. Namely, the early brain activity, the RP or whatever deviation from the baseline has been measured, causes the consciousness of the will. I mean, who said that RP causes the action? It might cause the decision and the consciousness of the decision. And then the consciousness of the decision causes the motion, which occurs later. So the RP, I don't know if you can see my, my cursor, but the RP starts back at 500 or 1,000. It could cause the later thing, the consciousness of will, and that causes the later thing, the motion. No problem, right? But the epiphenomenal view, which is also consistent with the data, says that the RP, or the brain activity, causes the motion directly without conscious will as a necessary middle step in the causal chain. You don't need the consciousness. Just like with Sergeant F, you can get the action without the consciousness. So how are we going to test that? Well, one crucial difference between the common sense view and the epiphenomenal view is that the RP causes the conscious will. Let's test that. And these are the experiments that I did with my colleagues, Alex Schlegel, Adina Roskis, Peter C., Talia Wheatley. The first thing we did was we looked at covariation. I think Eve mentioned Haggard and Eimer early experiment where they looked at correlation. And sure enough, all of the data that leads to the nice, neat Libet diagram is averaging 40 trials. So we took 20 subjects, averaged the 40 trials, but we also averaged the first 20, the early 20, and the late 20. That is the early deviation from baseline for the RP, and the late RP, and the early conscious will or report of consciousness of will, and the late. Now, if, correlation does not imply causation, but causation requires correlation. If the RP is causing the conscious will, as the common sense view says, then the early RPs should be early Ws and the late RPs should be late Ws, but they're not. The RP starts on average at the same time, regardless of whether it's early or late W. And that's what Haggard and Eimer found. They found that there was a difference in the LRP. We didn't find that difference in the LRP and showed actually why there were some defects in their demonstration of it. So neither the LRP nor the RP seems to be causing the consciousness of will as on the common sense interpretation. The other way to test causation is manipulation. The common sense interpretation claims that conscious will is necessary intermediate cause, right, between the RP, the brain activity, and the M, the movement. If so, then if we remove the conscious will, when we still have the M, we should not find an RP, because if the RP is causing the M, right, then we shouldn't be able to get a CW without an RP. And so the trick was, how can you get an M, that is a motion, without the participant and the subject consciously willing to move? How do you get their hand to move without them consciously willing it? And what we came up with was hypnosis. So we hypnotized participants, and then in a post-hypnotic suggestion, we got them to squeeze the ball when an arrow appeared on the screen, either to the right or to the left. And we excluded people who recalled being hypnotized. So these people did not remember being hypnotized, but they reacted to the post-hypnotic suggestion. And the instructions we gave them were to squeeze the ball whenever you want, just like in the Libet experiment, and report the time on the Libet clock when you made the choice to squeeze, okay? And we had a cover story. We said, that little electrode on your hand, which is really an EMG, that little electrode, it's been messing up. So sometimes it makes people squeeze. And so we want you to tell us, whenever you squeeze the ball, we want you to tell us whether you chose to squeeze or whether the electrode made you squeeze. And so we got people to say, oh no, the electrode made me squeeze the ball that time, which means they were not conscious of choosing themselves, even though the electrode did nothing of the kind. They had no consciousness of willing. And when we did this, we got the same type of RP. I've got the references down there at the bottom. Same kind of RP and the same LRP for the hypnosis and volition cases. Notice this one looks a little different. It's very noisy because we only found a few subjects that met our stringent criteria. But the relation of the volition and hypnosis there are actually the opposite of what the common sense interpretation would have predicted. So if anything, it's going the other way. So what these experiments suggest is that neither the RP nor the LRP causes the consciousness of will. So if it causes the motion, then it causes it directly without any causal role for the consciousness. So the common interpretation of the Libet result seems to fall, but the epiphenomenal interpretation stands. Okay. Now, a lot of people have been saying, the previous people on the panel, been saying, this only applies to a very specific kind of random, minimal bodily acts where you have no reason one way or the other. Fine, I agree. I still think it's interesting because when people teach free will, they go, here, I'll show you I'm free. I can move my hand right or left, and they make arbitrary views. A lot of people think that's when we are free. And we have experimental results to suggest that people think that too. But it's still only minimal bodily acts with no reason. So does it generalize? Here's a separate challenge, which is what I call the challenge of mechanism. And it runs like this. And this applies to all actions. Cognitive neurosciences, they want to find electrochemical explanations of our actions, right? Electricity in the brain, neurotransmitters being transferred across synapses, and so on, right? None of those explanations ever refer to any conscious mental state. They simply refer to the electrical activity and the neurotransmitters. So if they can explain our actions and our decisions, then it looks like conscious mental states, including conscious will, is not really necessary to cause any act because we can explain it without even mentioning consciousness or conscious will. Okay, so let me just say one thing about this, because philosophers talk about causation in a way that I find a lot of other people don't. We tend to think of properties as causes. So think of throwing a red brick through a window and breaking the window. The one brick has both mass and color. They are two properties of a single thing. But it's the mass that causes the window to shatter. It's not the color that causes the window to shatter. So we have to find out which properties of the thing are causally efficacious or potent or causal, however you want to put it. But we don't need to mention its color to explain the shattering in the window. So it looks like the fact that we don't mention it explains why it's not a cause in this case. So the analogy is mental properties and physical properties. I take it to be properties of a single brain. That's what physicalists claim. Physicalists don't have to deny that the brain has some mental properties. They simply deny that those are in some separate substance or a separate thing. You know, they're not two bricks, they're just one, even though it has two properties. Similarly, there's just one brain that has mental and physical properties. So if that's the case, as the physicalists claim, then physical properties can cause the actions, right? Even if mental properties do not cause the actions. That's the challenge. That's the challenge from epiphenomenalists like Huxley and Nietzsche and Libet and Wegner to a certain extent, okay? So what we have to ask is, do mental properties of the brain, we're not being dualists here, do mental properties of the brain and consciousness as one of those mental properties of the brain, can that cause action? So here's the solution I want to propose. It starts with multiple realizability. A mental state can be realized in different brain states. This has been argued at great length by philosophers. I'll just give you a quick mention of the issue and the arguments for it, or one argument for it. Then there's insensitivity. Some effects, such as the actions we perform, are not sensitive to the neural or physical realizer of the mental state. It doesn't matter what the physical realizer is. What matters is the mental state or the mental properties, including consciousness, because the effects are sensitive to those, okay? And if those are both true, then it looks like consciousness is what causes the act, just like the mass of the brick is what causes the shattering of the window. But we have to show multiple realizability and then insensitivity. First, multiple realizability. It's this fancy philosophical term, but it's got a pretty common sense meaning that you can think of in terms of a dollar. An abstract thing like a dollar can be realized either as 4 quarters or as 10 dimes, or 2 quarters and 5 dimes, or 20 nickels, or whatever you want. But let's just stick to 4 quarters and 10 dimes for simplicity. Now, Eve asked me, to borrow $1 because she wants to buy a drink in a machine. And I go, reach in my pocket, and I find I've got 4 quarters and 10 dimes. I go, here, Eve, why don't you take the dimes? I give her the dimes, and she says, thank you, right? And then she goes over and puts them in the machine, gets her drink out and drinks, okay? So what caused her to feel grateful to me, a mental effect, and to say thank you, a physical effect that required her to move her mouth, right? So it can have a mental effect. What caused that? You might think, well, it was that I gave her 10 dimes, but not really, because she's a friend of mine. If I hadn't given her 10 dimes, I would have given her the 4 quarters. If I'd given her the 4 quarters, she would have been equally grateful and said thank you. So what really matters is that I gave her $1, because $1 is what she needed. And so the abstract thing, the dollar, describes the cause better than the particular realization in 10 dimes or 4 quarters. And I want to say the mind's like that. Mental properties are multiply realizable. And here I'm going to refer back to the Freed study that has been mentioned before. They had people do Libet with electrodes in their brains during epilepsy preparation. And what you found, one feature of this is that on the different raster plots, you can see that different neurons fired on different trials. It's not like there were certain neurons that whenever they fired, the person moved, and when they didn't fire, the person didn't move. It was rather that of this group of neurons, if enough of them increased their firing rates by enough, then the person would move. But which particular neurons fired didn't matter. It's like the dollar. It doesn't matter whether it's quarters or dimes. What matters is that you got enough to make up $1. What matters in the brain is not whether it's these neurons or those neurons. What matters is whether you've got enough neurons firing at a higher rate that you get the mental property, okay? So is it sensitive though? That's the second question. That's multiple realizability. Is it sensitive? Here, I appeal to Alfred Hitchcock. Just, imagine yourself taking a shower. I'm going in to take a shower, and just as I'm about to step in the shower, I remember the shower scene from Alfred Hitchcock's classic horror movie, Psycho. And I go, oh my God, now I don't feel comfortable. And so I go out and I lock the door before I get in the shower. Now notice that my memory of the shower scene caused a mental effect, namely fear, which then caused a physical effect, me walking over the door to lock it, okay? So the memory of the shower scene, whoa, that's a mental thing. So the insensitive solution says, hey, the shower is going to feel fear, and it's going to lock the door just in case they remember the shower scene. But the shower scene, the memory of the shower scene can be realized in a number of different patterns of neurons firing at different rates, as long as it meets a certain, kind of population level threshold. And this is fairly common from very recent theories in cognitive neuroscience. So the effects are not sensitive to the particular brain state. They are sensitive to the mental state. And so it looks like the mental properties are the ones that capture the level of generality that's relevant to causation. Just like I argued that dollar, the abstract category, captures the level of generality that's relevant to causing Eve to feel grateful and thank me, okay? So it looks like the mental memory of the scene, not its physical, any particular physical realizer, is what has mental effects, fear, and physical effects, walking and locking the door. It also has physical effects like amygdala, blood flow, and so on, okay? So I want to say the same argument applies to consciousness. I mean, I referred to fear because it's nice to be concrete, but the same argument applies to consciousness. Can consciousness cause bodily movements that are actions? And the answer is, yeah, if it's multiply realizable, and it is, according to our best theories of neuroscience, and if the causal effect is not sensitive to the particular realization, but is instead sensitive to whether it's conscious or not, as it is in a lot of experiments that have been done. So that model can show you how consciousness at least can cause effects in the physical world, including our actions. However, notice that this argument works only when the physical effects, including the actions, are not sensitive to the particular physical realizers of consciousness. If the movement, to the extent that the movement is sensitive to the physical realizer, it's not due to the mental state. To the extent that it's sensitive to the mental state or the consciousness, it's due to the consciousness. So we need to do science in order to tell us when consciousness is having these effects. I've given you a model to show how it's possible, but we need to figure out, the different causal effects, some of which might depend on the physical realizer, some of which might depend on the mental state, but at least this establishes that consciousness, a way in which consciousness can cause physical actions and other physical effects as well. So I want to say that's the end of my talk. But as so often, the end is really the beginning, because we have to go out and do that hard science of finding out when consciousness is multiply realized and the effects of it are sensitive to the conscious or not, as opposed to this physical realizer or that other one. Thanks. I don't know what I did on time there. Tried to go a little fast to leave a little more time for others and for the discussion.
Yeah, thank you for that stimulating talk. We have about 4 minutes for panel discussion. So if any of our panelists have questions for Walter, we can ask them now. Oh, Aaron, we still can't hear you, or at least I can't. I hear a loud pitched noise though, so something's coming through. No, not yet. Anybody else hear him?
No, just the squeal.
Maybe it's your earphones, Aaron?
Yeah, I think it must be your earphones. If you want to type the question to me, I can ask it.
Now you're muted.
Oh, how about now?
Oh, now we got, now
I'm
you're
just using my computer, not my earphones. So those earphones are not trustworthy, are they? It's a good thing they. So I'm just wondering. I mean, in your anecdote about the shower scene, why it necessarily has to be the case that consciousness intervened at all? I mean, couldn't it be that the scene itself primes knowledge from memory about potential danger? And that leads to you locking the door, along with, right, a conscious experience of the memory and of the danger that it signaled. Why does it? I'm not sure how, in that line of arguing, why it's necessarily entailed that consciousness has to be in that has to occupy that kind of position in the causal chain. Where it,
So it's not entailed. I meant to be proposing a model. And one of the main reasons at the end, I said, we got to do this science to find out. What you want to know is whether it's the memory of the shower scene, whether it's conscious or not, that has those effects, or whether it's only when the memory is conscious that it has those effects. Now, in order to answer that question, you'd have to have some way of determining that the person was remembering the shower scene, even though they weren't conscious of it, so they're not going to be able to report it. I don't know how to do that, but that is the crucial question. Notice that let me just add also that if you start talking about unconscious recall of the shower scene, then you run into you're still going to be granting that mental states, namely the unconscious recall, has the effect. You won't be showing that consciousness has the effect. But you're absolutely right. In order to really test whether the consciousness is doing the work and whether it's sensitive to consciousness as opposed to the presence or absence of a memory, we would have to, find out what happens when the person recalls it but is not conscious of recalling it. And I don't know how to test that. You're the scientist. You're supposed to be telling me.
All right, any other questions from our panelists before we move to the general Q&A?
I'll just let us move to the general Q&A. I mean, I had a similar thing to what Aaron ended up saying, so yeah.
All right, so we will move to the general questions that have been submitted by the audience. You three have generated hundreds of questions, so I don't know if that's standard, but I'm getting a lot of questions here. So we have an upvote system, so I'm just going to pick the one that's been upvoted the most. This one goes to Aaron. The question is, suppose the part of the brain that is conscious is not the part that decides. Does that explain these results? The part that decides has free will, but the conscious part just finds out about the decision late. What is the problem with this interpretation?
I don't think there's any problem with it. I'm not sure it's the right interpretation. I think it's fine. It's just that's not, if you ask someone what kind of, what kind of free will do you believe you have, or what do you consider to be free will, I think most people associate it with consciousness, with conscious decisions. That's the kind of free will that people think they have or that they want to have.
Thank you. Let's see, a question for Eve. Might the subconscious intuition or other emotional processes play a role in the deliberative case, making the WMR window shorter or easier?
I mean, I would think so. We obviously haven't tested something like that, but I think that emotions in general do play a role in a lot of things. And I'm not sure in what context this question was asked, like if there's a specific things, but we are going to be looking at people with different mood disorders as well, and that could maybe shed a light on whether this would impact the WMR window. So we have the data, we haven't analyzed it yet. It's very possible that different degree of, say, depression or anxiety or different emotions could play a role. I don't want to say something, because we haven't analyzed the data yet, but potentially, and that's why we will be looking at the data. So thank you.
Just a follow up to that, a couple people asked also about arousal. Could arousal impact the effects that you were showing?
With respect to time perception in general, arousal has been shown to play a role in time perception. So certainly it may have an impact. It may slow down or speed up. If you were to believe in the clock model of time perception, that could speed things up or slow things down. So therefore, yes, arousal potentially could play a role. I haven't thought much in terms of that window, the size of the WMR window, but it potentially. The other thing that one could think about is whether or not it would delay or would it give an early W versus a late W, right? So if you're more anxious, perhaps you want to press that button sooner and therefore shorten it. But yes, certainly. And again, like I said, we have depression data, we have anxiety data, so arousal would be built into that data as well. So hopefully next year I could give you a bit more solid answer to that. But certainly this is a great question and something that we would like to pursue further.
Gotcha, thank you. Let's see, Uri, your top voted question. Do you think there's any valuable distinction between consciousness and awareness? Whoops, sorry, everything just changed. Let me find that again. Okay, here we go. Do you think that there's a valuable distinction between consciousness and awareness in the Libet type experiments? Can you imagine an actor that has consciousness but who may not be aware of his volition in such a way that can be verbalized at some specific time?
Well, you could be creature conscious, of course, but yet not aware of a certain thing, right? So I guess in that respect, I can certainly imagine somebody who's generally conscious but is not conscious of a specific thing. I guess in a more general setting, or in a more general sense, related also to the other talks in this panel, maybe even more so to what Eve was talking about. If you think about the W time and where it's placed and so on, there's work by Matsuhashi and Hallett where they asked people to how did it go? So people were just told to make a decision or to press a button, lift their hand, press a button. I don't remember exactly what it was. Whenever they had the urge to do so. But if there was a tone that was played and that tone came after, well, let's say if the tone came and they could still stop themselves from moving, then they should stop themselves from moving. And then using some statistics on that, they showed that W in that situation was way earlier. If I remember correctly, it's like 1.42 seconds before movement onset. On average. And what they suggested, and others too, following that result, is that perhaps there could be a situation where if you're probed, like in that, if you're asked, did you decide already? You might say something like, oh, you know what, I actually, yeah, maybe I did. But if you're asked to just report it, as in the Libet paradigm of, well, where was the clock when you decided, then it's much later. So perhaps there's some kind of a process of decision making, right? It's not so much maybe an event as perhaps Libet thought. It's more of a process. And earlier on, you are conscious of it only if you're probed. Later on, you're conscious of it, like maybe more fully conscious of it. So you could think about some kind of conscious progression here. Again, I'm not sure if this gets at the difference between awareness and consciousness, and maybe one of the other panelists has something better to say about this, but I mean, you could think about like some kind of a progression of consciousness or of awareness, depending on how you define these things.
Thank you. And if any of the other panelists want to weigh in on these questions, feel free. Any thoughts on that one?
I mean, those two words get used in very different ways by different people and in different contexts. So it's really a tricky one. I mean, you might say that a person in a vegetative state who sometimes sits up in bed and shows some, what you might say, awareness of their surroundings, but isn't conscious. I've heard people use, talk in those terms. I typically don't make a distinction. For me, if I'm conscious of something or I'm aware of something, I'm saying the same thing. So it really depends on the kind of framework or theoretical framework that you subscribe to as to whether or not you make such a distinction.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple questions for Walter. Here's your most upvoted question. If these effects are not sensitive to particular brain states, how do you explain your sergeant losing consciousness because of the loss of a small region of their brain? Is it because the brain state is altered, i.e. the networks are disrupted, that consciousness is altered? If you lose dimes or quarters, you don't have a dollar anymore. I don't think these analogies apply to the brain and consciousness.
So let me take the part about the sergeant. The sergeant actually had a fairly massive brain injury. It wasn't just a small area. I don't know what counts as small, but it's more injury than I would ever want to have. And there was a fairly large part of the brain affected. Notice that what the Freed study showed in those raster plots that I went was that it's there has to be a certain, there have to be enough neurons whose firing rate is increased enough within a certain area, for there to be the decision in that case, for the RP. But the same would hold for consciousness. If you knock out a whole region, you've knocked out, probably, hundreds of thousands of neurons. And if you knock out that many neurons, then you might have knocked out enough so that he's not going to be conscious, unless maybe something on the other side is working. And that's why you can explain it sometimes and not others. However, this is all speculation. We do not have enough information about the case in the 19th century to really know what was going on. That's the problem with looking at historical cases. They didn't, delve into it in enough detail that we can really tell.
Yeah, thank you. Question for Aaron. Let's see, everything's moved again. Sorry about that. As new questions come in, my little dialogue moves. Okay, do you have any knowledge about what the magnitude of the stochastic fluctuations are a function of? For example, random fluctuations in a liquid are a function of temperature.
That's a good question. I can say that those random fluctuations are there all the time, and that they do vary. Let's say their signature, which is their spectral properties, do vary depending on things like your state of arousal. So they're different when you're in a deep sleep compared to when you're awake, and they can also differ depending on the level of engagement in a task, for example. So they do vary. And that might be a way actually to, a good future direction for research along those lines is to look at, if those underlying ongoing fluctuations do play a role in producing the readiness potential, then that would suggest that the readiness potential might have a different shape under different tasks or under different circumstances, let's just put it that way, different contexts. Might also have a different shape depending upon, because different individuals actually show different signature, different spectral properties of their ongoing fluctuations. So that would suggest that there might be a systematic difference in the shape of the readiness potential depending on each individual's particular spectral properties of their noise. So those are predictions that the model makes that could in principle be tested.
And I was wondering, can that explain why you don't see the potential in some people? You were saying there's cases where you're not detecting it.
It could. There could be other reasons why we don't see a clear readiness potential in some individuals. Those could be anatomical because of the way that the cortex is oriented with respect to the recording electrodes. But yes, that's one potential explanation. I should say that's an avenue of research that hasn't really been explored very much and deserves to be. Why there's so much inter-subject variability in the shape of the RP and why some subjects don't really exhibit one.
Thank you. We have a new top question. This one's for all of our panelists. The question is a simple yes or no. Do you believe in free will? But you can give some explanation on that for either answer. Remember, this is being recorded.
We should let the philosopher go first.
So, I mean, my view is that our wills are free from constraint or excuse, but they're not free from causation or determination. And so you can't ask, do we have free will or not? Because you have to ask free from what? I don't think it's free from causation or determination, but it's free from the types of constraints that make us unable to act in accordance with what we think is the best thing to do. So it's not a simple yes or no. It's no for freedom from causation and yes for freedom from constraint.
What he said. I mean, more seriously, this is actually also my general view. I don't think that we have this freedom to just kind of, okay, the world stops whenever I make a decision. I kind of leave the world, I make my decision, and I somehow go back in, and the world now revolves around me in a different way. But yes, we are in the sense of, again, of course, I mean, any question about free will requires this. I mean, it's a kind of like a two-part question of what does it entail for us to have free will, and then do we have that? So in that sense, of freedom from being caused, like being some kind of uncaused cause, I share Walter's opinion. But in terms of like freedom or free will in the sense that we are, let's say, morally responsible, then I do think that we are, because I do think that we are free to make some decisions on which we are responsible, if that helps.
It might be worth adding that this was one of the questions that the neuroscientists asked the philosophers in that book that Uri mentioned at the very beginning. And so if you want to see more detail, there's a whole chapter on that.
Did we talk about that book? Maybe we should. Yeah, anyway. yeah, it is true. There's a whole chapter on that.
So for me, I think that we, to some extent, have the ability to make choices, and therefore at the, say, local level, I think we do get to do that. But I think that previous experiences do guide our decisions. So in that sense, perhaps, you know, you don't necessarily have that full ability because you have sort of been influenced in some form. It's really difficult to really answer that question. I personally would like to hope and think that I have free will, just so that I feel like I have control over my own decisions. I did ask this question to my 9-year-old, whether or not we have free will, and his answer was that we do have free will. Of course I have free will. I have the ability to do anything I want, except for when mommy says no. So, you know, so as you can see, like, you can answer this question in so many different ways, but ultimately I think that it's a long way to scientifically really prove one way or the other, but whatever you believe in, I think it will be okay in the end. So yeah, that's my sort of avoiding the question answer kind of thing.
So personally, I would say that I'm agnostic about whether or not we have free will. I certainly don't hold a strong belief that we don't have free will, but I'm also not sure that we do. I do believe that science can potentially cast some serious doubt on the possibility of conscious free will, although it hasn't quite yet done so, but it could potentially. But it's really hard to imagine how science could prove the existence of free will. That's a tough one. But I would say that I certainly have, I guess like most people, subjective experiences of having free will. I certainly feel like I have free will sometimes, and other times I really feel like I don't.
All right, well, thank you. All great answers, especially your kid's answer, Eve. I love that. Okay, let's see. We have a couple of questions for Eve. One, is it possible to use a tone to make W estimations earlier rather than later? If so, do you think you will see the opposite effect on difficulty ratings? And that is, they will be perceived earlier.
Sure, thank you for that question. This is more of a methodological constraints, if you will. We were able to do it by using the tone that comes afterwards and therefore shifting it. In order to do this, Bill Banks and I tried this a while ago to try to shift W back, and we weren't successful at it, but it involved using a hand going through a sensor that would detect your hand and perhaps, you know, generate a tone that would prompt you to hear the tone sooner, and therefore, in theory, that should shift W back. For us, just because we were limited in resources at the time, we weren't able to do it, but conceptually, that could be one way of shifting W back. Another way of shifting W back that we have tried is actually to kind of go to this other literature on what's called the representational momentum effect, and this is from psychophysics and perception. So what that is actually taking advantage of the clock, the Libet clock. The Libet clock is the way it works is that you have a dot and it moves around the clock face. It's a motion perception, right? So this REMO, the representation momentum, suggests that if you are looking at something that's in motion, you have you tend to over-predict its final position. So in other words, the reading of that time W could be over-projected. But if you could find a way to minimize representation momentum, you might be able to then get W to be earlier. And we have found that when we tested it with people with like older population, as well as people with Parkinson's disease patients who tend to not see motion as well. And then their time W actually would be a little bit earlier. We didn't extend this to the WMR and we didn't look at it from that angle, but in terms of sort of achieving the ability, achieving to get W to move back in terms of the verbal report, we were able to do it in some form. It would be nice to see what that would be like. And I think what the audience member who asked this question, I would think that would, it might have a reverse effect. I don't know. We didn't go very far, but at least that's how far we got in terms of shifting W around.
Thank you. I think I'm getting a comment from our tech community that Roger Penrose will be discussing the possibility of backward time retroactivity.
Did Jay freeze?
Hi, Jay, come back.
Yeah, he froze and the sound went out. Yeah, I don't know.
Everybody.
Oh, there we go. You're back. You're back. You froze for a little bit.
Okay. I was getting a question from our tech crew on the chat channel. This might actually be coming from Stuart Hammeroff. But the question is, could backward time effects relate to the readiness potential? I wonder if anyone wants to comment on backwards time. And also, Roger Penrose will be giving a talk about backwards time effects tomorrow in a couple experiments.
So I'm not sure. I mean, there are different senses in which one could interpret backwards time effects. I mean, they're the kinds of thing that Libet talked about in his direct cortical stimulation experiments and so on, that we consciously refer the time of something back a little ways because consciousness is a bit delayed with respect to other processes that underlie the initiation of movement. But or are we talking about like literally going backwards in time?
My guess would be literally going backwards in time. In certain equations in physics, you can run time forward or backwards and get the same causative effects. So I'm guessing Roger will be talking about that, but I don't want to speak for him.
Can I make one comment on this? I think, even if that's possible, the issue that I take interests a lot of people in Libet is whether people have free will and whether consciousness has effects and whether people are responsible. And I'm not sure that quantum effects, even if they did produce backward causation, I'm not sure it would do much to affect free will, control, consciousness, responsibility, the issues that, at least for philosophers, are the big ones at stake here.
Yeah, continuing on what Walter said, right? I mean, so let's say that your behavior is governed not by some quantum random die that was cast somewhere. Is that going to help you become more or less morally responsible? I guess that's one thing. The second question is this, I mean, in science, you typically want to give the most parsimonious interpretation or the most parsimonious model for what you have. And I'm wondering whether taking something like, going backwards in time, is that really the most parsimonious way to explain this? Last how quantum mechanics explains consciousness, that it's some kind of like the minimization of mysteries in the world. So quantum seems to be, quantum mechanics seems to be quite mysterious. Consciousness seems to be quite mysterious. They somehow have to be related to minimize the number of mysteries. I don't know that that's on its own is a good enough reason to assume that these things are connected. Again, they may be, but I don't know that it's the most parsimonious way or to explain things.
Thank you for addressing the question. We have about, let's see, 8 minutes left, so I'll pick a question for Walter. Would you agree that your solution applies only to mental states that can be given a functional definition, and thus not to phenomenal consciousness, for example, sensory experiences and the feeling of fear?
No, I don't see why it would be limited to functional states. It might also apply to phenomenal states. You always wonder where the questioner's coming from. Jagwon Kim suggests that position in physicalism or something near enough, because he argues that the phenomenal states are not reducible in the same, or don't have function. I guess the best way to put it is are not functional states in the same way. I actually disagree with Jagwon about that. And I don't see why you wouldn't be able to say the phenomenal state is multiply realizable in different arrangements of neural firings. And also that the effect is sensitive to the phenomenal state and not just to the functional states, even if the phenomenal state is not functional. So actually, again, I hate to keep selling our book, but Ned Block addresses this question in a chapter in the book that Uri and I are editing in much more depth, but that's my quick answer.
All right, thank you. Walter or Uri, did you want to say anything else about the book? We have just about 5 minutes left.
It's a great book. Everybody ought to buy it. And it was a lot of fun. I'll say one more quick thing about it. I think, a lot of times when people do interdisciplinary work, including consciousness, focused on consciousness instead of free will. Our book's on free will and moral responsibility. But it's a good paradigm to say, well, you got these people coming together with these other people. What do these people want those people to answer? What do those other people want these people to answer? Put the questions up on a website, vote about which ones are the most important, and then get the people that represent one perspective to answer what the other perspective wants them to answer. You end up with the important questions because you're asking them what they want, and you can do it for economics and political science. You can do it for any combination of fields, or neuroscience and philosophy on a number of different topics. So I hope that this format of book becomes popular, and not just the particular one that we started out with.
It was also, I think, good to give let people then ask follow-up questions. It's another thing that we did, because it let so either the person asking the original question or other people want to chime in, and so it becomes a bit more of a dialogue, which is something that we try to keep in this book, but like maybe a kind of like a dialogue, a systematic dialogue or something like that. So yeah, enough shameless plugging of this book.
Shameless.
All right, thank you. We have time for one more question. This one can go to any of our panelists. It was asked a few times. Could you explain this result? So I think they're talking about the Leavitt paradigm in particular, in terms of an inaccurate perception of time.
You mean, I take it the question means an inaccurate perception of the timing of consciousness. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a question for Eve. She's the one that works on time perception.
I just want to clarify, are we talking about like the timing of time, say like the conscious time W, or we're talking about, is that what the question is?
I think he's talking about W time, yeah. Libet's result, the fact that the RP starts before W.
I think that has been one line of effort that I began, with respect to this research is to question whether time W that people report, so this is again reported verbally, whether or not it's inaccurate or accurate. And like I said early on in the talk, that we have shown that this might not be accurate. It's much more subjective. It can be biased. It could be influenced. So the problem, and from the paper that Bill and I wrote back in 2009, we did say that W is inferred, at least partially, from other things. So short answer to this question is yes, I think that time W is shifting around, and that could cause a problem in terms of the interpretation. Because if you could shift W forward far back enough, and that's why we wanted to try to shift W as far as we possibly could. And the Hallett paper that I think Uri mentioned, I think we're able to achieve that by going back as far as like 1 second or 1.5 seconds earlier. So if you could shift time W to go further back, and maybe that's where the real W is, right? Maybe that's where the veridical W is, and it comes before the readiness potential, then the interpretation totally would be very different from what we have now in terms of that interpretation. There have been a lot of effort into trying to find the real W, but for the purpose of my talk, I wanted to again to emphasize here that that we're talking about this subjective experience, whether or not it's veridical, if it aligns with the real or not the real W. It's besides the point. For that, we just want to see what that feels like. But yeah, so again, short answer is I think that W is biased, and it shifts around. And if you were to try to do a different format, a different interpretation, you have to be sure that you get the real W. Yeah,
so can I ask Eve a question? Is this legitimate?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, whether it's accurate is one thing, but if it changes, 50 milliseconds, even 100 milliseconds forward, and you haven't gotten it to go backward, the temporal relationship between the initiation of the RP and the W remains the same, unless you get the W all the way back before, and you haven't done that. So it seems to me the important thing is that relationship between the two, not whether you've got it at the exact time. There's another thing that you talked about in your paper that in the difficult decisions, you said, I didn't get an RP, but in the data you showed, there was a deviation from baseline way back, more than a second before the motion, even though it was not the shape of an RP. So it seems to me that the crucial question that matters for the Libet argument is whether the initiation of the deviation from baseline, whether it's an RP shape or not, whether that comes before the W. And the timing variations that you found don't seem to draw that relationship into question.
But there's another critical question too, which is what does that deviation from baseline mean? And it doesn't necessarily mean that the brain is getting ready.
That data that I showed you was actually just to represent the two distinctions between easy versus difficult, to try to see how that mapped onto the Libet task. And what I was really trying to show is that when it's an easy decision, you kind of elicit a readiness potential that's similar to what Libet would find. So that's just trying to show that, hey, you have, my easy trials are very comparable to the Libet trial. The signal, the brain activity for decisions in the difficult trials that deviate from that, like Aaron is saying, it may mean a number of things, and it may or may not mean what the readiness potential supposed to mean. I don't have right now a good speculation necessary to what it means, but the fact that they look different, I'm just using it at the basic superficial level here to say that, hey, the difficult ones don't look like an RP, and that's all that's signal that graph was to show. Yeah. Sorry, did I miss another question? Was there another part of that? I think I forgot something. Maybe not.
So Yeah, I don't want to take up the time if you have another question in the chat. I want to give other people a chance.
We're about out of time, so you could ask your final question and then we'll end.
So I guess, it's not clear what the deviation from baseline at the beginning of the RP or at the beginning of the form that you found in the difficult decisions. Both of them, there was a deviation from baseline, significant deviation from baseline, more than 1 second before. Now, Aaron's right. We don't know what those mean, right? But if that brain activity is the initiation of a causal sequence that leads to the motion, then the initiation of the causal sequence that leads to the motion is starting before the people are aware of making a decision. And I took that to be the essential problem that Libet was posing. There are a lot of the questions about what it means, what the RP means and whether this is an RP or not and what to count it. Those are interesting questions for understanding decision making. But, for the philosophical lessons regarding free will and moral responsibility and all that's, and the causation of consciousness, it's what's important is the temporal relation between the deviation from baseline, whatever it's doing, as long as it's causing the motion, and the timing of the consciousness. And I thought in your experiments, Eve, the relationship between those two states remained constant, even though they were deviating due to your manipulations.
Yep, Walter, you're absolutely right. And that was one thing that's why we were trying to do this experiment where we want to shift W forward and we couldn't due to a number of reasons. One of the things that I tried later on, and we still don't have the RP, was actually to look at some other methods, other means to get to time W. And we actually went in a different direction. Instead of looking at a verbal report, we actually had people look at, we recorded eye data. So this was an eye tracking experiment where they had to differentiate which one they like more or less. And essentially they had to make a decision which one they prefer more. Long story short, we were able to differentiate which one they would decide based on how long they look at each of the two choices a lot earlier. I think we went as far back as 2.5 seconds to 2.5 seconds. And again, I apologize that we don't have the RP to go with this, and we wanted to look at RP, we just couldn't do it. But having that time to go back further than what a typical Libet task usually offers, and know that moment when the two, if you imagine two curved lines, one for one that they essentially prefer, and that's the amount of looking time, they look at the one that they prefer a lot longer. And this is shown in other studies as well. But we can go as far back as about 2.5 seconds to 3 seconds before they actually make that motor response. And we kind of thought that might be the real-time W that we potentially could use if we were to couple it with a brain activity like the readiness potential. Again, I don't have evidence to support that claim, but that would be actually along the same line of what Walter is suggesting. If we could show that time W comes before the readiness potential, then surely the interpretation would change. That's all I could really say about it because that's all I have in terms of data, but conceptually that's one way of approaching it. We just could do it with the regular time W in the context of a Libet paradigm, but we went to a different route to try to do it. Yeah, I hope
that would be extremely interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of our session time. I want to particularly thank our speakers. Those were all definitely fascinating and stimulating talks. And thank you for all your thoughts after. So we'll have a break now, and Plenary 9 will be starting at 2:10 p.m. The title of that plenary is the Universe Conscious? So it should be an interesting one. Please come back. Thank you very much to our speakers.